Good day to you, my dear students. Once again, I'm Sean Xavier Alcalita for the next topic of Jose Rizal entitled The Looking Back at the Filipino Past. So, here we're talking here about the unspoken or the other masterpiece of Jose Rizal, which is the annotation on Antonio de Morga's Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas. So, let's take a closer look. So, learning objectives. So, at the end of this chapter, the student should be able to argue the reasons why Jose Rizal decided to annotate Antonio de Morga's work, Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas, to relate how Rizal's annotations conform with the overall aims of the propaganda movement, and lastly, to create their own annotations of a sample text. Okay, so with regards to the vocabulary, number one, audiencia or the royal audiencia is known to be the court of justice in Spain and its colonies. And it's equivalent to the court, to the trial court here in our context of our times. Now, ecclesiastics are known to be the religious missionaries, no? So these are the missionaries, or these are the, shall we call the priests, no? The regular priests who belong to any religious congregation. When you say secular is having ideas and attitudes not determined or irrelevant by any religious bias. Okay, so let's talk, before we talk about the successors, let's talk about the background of the author in the name of Antonio de Morga. So he's known to be the Spanish administrator who served the Philippines in the late 16th century. He was born in Seville in 1559. He graduated from the University of Salamanca in 1574. And in 1578, he attained a doctorate in the canon law, in the church law, no? And then he taught briefly in Osuna, later returning to Salamanca to read the civil law. In 1580, he joined the government service. He was appointed in the 1593 to Manila as the lieutenant governor. So when you say the lieutenant governor, he is known to be the second most powerful position of the colony, next to Governor General of the Philippines. And in 1598, he resigned from his post to assume the office of oidor, or the judge, in an audiencia or in the court of justice in Spain. Okay, so de Morga's fame or infamy, depending on which account you're reading, came in 1600, no? When he was put in charge of the Spanish fleet against a Dutch invasion under the leadership of Olivier van Noort. And although the Dutch sailed away, the Spaniards lost heavily, and according to de Morga, he jumped the ship and swam ashore with nothing but the enemy's standard in his hand. The Dutch account of the battle describes de Morga as the hiding and crying in his flagship before it sank. And de Morga's reputation in the colony sank, no, because of that, no. Like his flagship, and in 1603 he was transferred to Mexico. Okay, so a particular malicious biographical note on de Morga was provided by Wenceslao Ritana, no? In his 3-volume Aparato Bibliográfico de in Historia General de Filipinas, so the biographical apparatus for general history of the Philippines, published in 1906. So in his entry to the Sucesos, Ritana recites a domestic scandal, no, to comment on de Morga's hard character because of what he did to her daughter, no, Juliana. How briefly Juliana, de Morga's eldest daughter, was discovered in 1602 to be in love with a man of a lower social standing, a soldier from Mexico. So de Morga and his wife first tried to discourage the relationship by beating up Juliana. shaving her hair, and finally locking her up in the house. Yet Juliana managed to escape from her parents' house by tying bed sheets together and lowering herself from her bedroom window to the street. So when De Morga discovered that his daughter had eloped, he brought in the Governor General himself to persuade Juliana of marriage. They were all unsuccessful because Juliana silenced a parental opposition by threatening to commit a social suicide by marrying a Negro if she was not allowed to marry her lover. De Morga never spoke to his daughter again and left her in Manila when he moved to Mexico. From Mexico, De Morga was moved to Quito in 1615, where he was the president of the Audiencia, so he's already considered the Chief Justice at that time, no? And lastly, again, De Morga found himself in trouble, and in 1625 was investigated for corruption and eventually found guilty. So he escaped humiliation and the gallows by dying himself in 1636, or by dying in 1636. So before the case was wound up, so that's why from there he died in the year 1636. Okay, so he began his work, The Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas. So it is claimed as a way of bringing back his bad reputation, no? Bringing back his reputation of saving face after the disaster with the Dutch invaders in Manila in 1600. Hence, it is De Morga's version of the Manila Bay left to history. So the work consists of the 8 chapters. So these are the 8 chapters, no? Of the first discoveries of the Eastern Islands, of the government of Dr. Francisco de Sande. The number 3 is on the government of Don Gonzalo Ronquillo de Pebalosa, the government of Santiago de Vera, Gomez Perez das Marinas, Don Francisco Tello, Pedro de Acuña, and the account of the Philippine Islands. And chapter 8 is the most interesting of all the chapters here. And let's take a closer look in the next slide. Okay, Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas. So the first 7 chapters mainly concerned on the political events which occurred in the colony during the terms of the first 11 Governor Generals in the Philippines, beginning with Miguel Lopez de Legazpi in 1565 to Pedro Acuña, who died in June of 1606. For present-day Filipinos, chapter 8 is the most interesting because it gives the description of the pre-Hispanic Filipinos, or rather the Indios of the Spanish contact. So the same chapter was indispensable for Rizal, not only for its ethnographic value, but more to help him to reconstruct the pre-Hispanic Philippines, which Rizal wanted to present to his countrymen. Okay, so here, while at the British Museum in 1889, Rizal found a copy of the first edition of Antonio de Morga's Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas and began copying the text by hand, because at that time there was no photocopy at that time, no? So he just copied the book from cover to cover, the entire book, by writing through the use of his hand, no? by writing to another piece of paper. So that's why he spent almost more or less 8 to 10 hours inside the British Museum almost every day, no, to copy the Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas, and annotated the work along the way with the intention of creating a critical work on the history of the Philippines. And despite hopes of getting the work published through the help of Antonio Regidor, Rizal ended up with no publisher when his annotation were done. And by September of 1889, Rizal decided to publish the annotations himself in Garnier Hermanos, so a printing press that is located in Paris, France. Okay, so why Jose Rizal choose Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas among all other early chroniclers written by the Spaniards? So it was not coincidental, no? And according to the Filipino historian Ambeto Campo, he provided 5 reasons behind Rizal's choice, no? The first reason was the fact that the Morgas work in its original Spanish edition was rare. And in fact, the original Spanish text have never been reprinted in full. So that's why it's rare, no? Maybe it's printed only by a small number of copies, and it was never been reprinted in full until Rizal published its annotations in 1889. And from there, and at that time, it seems that the only surviving copy at that time was in the British Museum. The second reason, unlike other early Spanish chronicles written by the ecclesiastics, by the friars, by the priests, it was the Morga, no, was chosen by Rizal, no, because the Morga was a civil administrator and therefore provided a secular view of historical events during the early Spanish colonial period. And the third reason, it relates to Rizal's belief that a secular account was more credible than those by religious missionaries, which is the third reason for his choice, no? That's the third reason. Okay, so the fourth reason, so it was more sympathetic towards the natives, no, and in contrast to biased accounts written by the friars. Finally, the Morga's work was a fitting choice because he was the eyewitness. Actually, he was the actor. He's also the eyewitness. At the same time, he was also one of the actors in the historical events that occurred during that period of early Spanish colonization. Okay, so Jose Rizal's masterpieces. So the first one, with the publication of the annotations to Sucesos, Rizal presented an outline of linear conception of history, no? And while the No Limitangere dealt with the 19th century or Rizal's present, the El Filibusterismo and the essay entitled The Philippines a Century Hence covered the future. So, the annotations of the Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas tackled the past. So, of all the 24 volumes of Rizal's writings, there are only 3 masterpieces. The first one is the annotation of the Morga Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas. So it's tackled about the past. The No Limitangere is tackling about the present, and the El Filibusterismo together with the essay Filipinas dentro de 100 años, which is considered to be Rizal's envision about the future of the Philippines. So the masterpieces cover the past, the present, and the future. Okay, so conclusion. So more than an attempt to write the country's history, however, Rizal's annotation of the Morga Sucesos must also be seen within the context of the propaganda movement. At the time when the Filipino propagandists were clamoring for reforms in Spain, presenting a critical narrative of the country's history might be considered as an endeavor to create a sense of national consciousness or identity that was anchored in a glorious past. Now, here in number 2, contrary to what has been presented in the history written by the friars, it here in the Morgas chapter 8 of Successos de las Islas Filipinas shows that even before the coming of the Spaniards, there was already life in the Philippines. There was already life with the lifestyle of our grand ancestors long time ago before the coming of the Spaniards. And there was already culture. Contrary to the belief the friars that our ancestors were so very barbaric, the Morga's presentation presents in this book has claimed that our life, or that there was already culture in the Philippines, and the culture was so very colorful. It's not barbaric actually, no. And most of all, the culture is so very colorful. We already have the food culture. There was already education at the time. There was already the method of marriage, the fiestas, or the celebration of the feast among the tribes at the time, the institution of marriage, as well as the institution of the faith, the pre-colonial faith of our grand ancestors at the time. So actually, our culture during the past time was so very colorful already, as presented by the Morga. So that's why it drives us to number 3, that the early Spanish chroniclers ridiculed the early Filipinos for being barbarians. So Rizal's copious notes of Successos revealed the early Filipino culture as rich and flourishing. Our culture was so very rich and flourishing. It was the Spaniards who assimilated our culture to the Western culture, and the hardest part of our identity, because our culture has been assimilated to the Western culture, particularly at the time to the Spanish culture, and today with the culture of the Europeans and Americans, so it was the Spaniards who discouraged the use of the baybayin. It's one of that. And the second one is our bahag, the culture of wearing, the men about bahag and the women of tapis, in exchange for camisa de chino, at saka yung pantalon, and with the women with the Filipina barotsaya. That's typically the Spanish, the Spanish type of assimilating our culture to the Western, to their culture of the Spaniards, So thus, Rizal's annotation may be considered an effort to assert Filipino identity with an oppressive colonial framework. So that's all for the topic, and I'm hoping for the next topic to be presented to you. That's all. Thank you very much.